Welcome to Too Many Lawyers, but not for long. Now, you probably are wondering, what do I mean? Are we shutting down Too Many Lawyers? Well, here's the deal. Under the leadership of our executive producer, Christian Blatt, we're soon going to be Lawyers with Balls. I'm going to explain that shortly.
I hope so, yeah. And by the way, I insist on Generalissimo.
Yeah.
It's not executive producer. That's not my official title.
We could do that. I'm flexible. Titles are fun. So in a few minutes, we're going to be joined by our guest, Ken Khachigian. He's the author of a new book, Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. He was a speechwriter and a counselor to both Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. He's like the Zelig of American political history. And the headline, you are not going to want to miss this. The headline of his book, he will explain why Richard Nixon should not have resigned, that the smoking gun tapes weren't smoky at all. So I am totally pumped for this. I mean, to talk to somebody, Christian, countless hours under his belt with Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. But a couple of important items before we get to Ken, and that's the name change. Now, I know, Christian, when you hear lawyers with balls, people think, oh, well, a pit bull lawyer, aggressive, annoying lawyers, as redundant as that is. But the idea of the revised show is that we're going to be playing games involving balls. Pool, table tennis, golf, with whatever guests are up for that. And, of course, as executive producer / generalissimo, your job is to locate people who are going to be happy to talk law, politics.
I'm currently putting together a special for around Christmas time. It'll be the beach volleyball episode. I'll let you know how it goes.
Absolutely. Just the ladies only.
Yeah, well, yeah.
No sense,
obviously.
No sense getting the guys. We've seen how they play.
We've seen Top Gun.
Yeah. So if we're playing pool, we won't be in the palatial Benstown studios here in Glendale. Remember, for all of your podcast and radio programming needs, call Benstown, California. That's all the address you need. Darren, what do you think? We get a break on the price because of that? Was that a good reading?
You will for me, yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Take it.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember the evangelist Billy Graham.
Oh, sure.
So when I was a kid and I listened to the radio and I'd hear him on the radio, and I was so taken by this expression. He'd give his sermon or his speech or whatever. And then at the end of the show, he'd say, write me, Billy Graham, Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's all the address you need. And that was it. And I thought, oh, my gosh, he's so big. You don't need 123 Main Street. You just need Billy in Minneapolis. I think this was before zip codes because, that's how old I am. That's all the address you need. So Glendale, California for Benstown. So the name Lawyers with Balls has already gotten me into trouble.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I was at a comedy benefit for the LA Assistance League last Saturday. I was sitting in the third row, and an amazing comic named Ben Glebe. G-L-E.
Oh, yeah, I know who he is. Yeah, I was on a show where he was a guest once.
Really?
Yeah,
he's terrific. So quick. So I made the mistake of sitting pretty much front row, right in the middle of third row. So, he sees, he does a bunch of crowd work near the end of his show. So he sees me. And like an idiot, I wore a quarter zip sweater around my neck, tied like I'm a preppy guy from the 70s.
You're the bad guy in every raunchy comedy from the 80s. Yeah,
Yes.
You're the guys who kick the nerds out of the frat house in Revenge of the Nerds.
Yep.
Yes,
so I was like the second or third person that he picked on, and oh my gosh, he has a lot of fun with the sweater. And then, what do you do? Well, I didn't want to say, I'm a legal analyst for Channel 4 or ABC. Or, you Mr. Fancy, you're better than all the other. Instead, I just said, I'm a retired lawyer. And so then that's good for 5 minutes. What could be more boring than a guy with a sweater around his neck? He's a retired lawyer. And what kind of law? Business law. Oh, even more boring. So then what do you do now? And so I say, podcaster. Okay, so that's good for a few more minutes.
Yeah,
So at this point, people are just rolling in the aisles because I'm complete puddle. So he finally says, well, what's the title of the podcast? And I say, Lawyers with Balls. And then, of course, he has a lot of fun with that. And then I made a mistake. He said, is this an audio? And I said, it's an audio. Well, no, the idea is if we play pool, it'll be video.
Of course.
But I said audio. Well, now he's having fun with the fact, you've got a podcast with a boring business lawyer with a thing around his neck, and it's audio, and you're playing pool. Clack, clack, clack. Oh my gosh. He made so much. It reminded me several years ago, I went to see Stephen Colbert. Actually, it was before he had the Late Show. It was the Colbert Report. And I went with a client. And the client was an insurance lawyer from New York. And he was wearing a very boring suit. And the warm-up guy, I think his name was Mercurio, he zeroes in on my client, and he spends 10 minutes totally humiliating him. And so I never got another case from that client. So it was pretty bad.
Well, the takeaway from both of those stories, it reminds me that I knew someone who did publicity for Don Rickles. So I was able to go see Rickles at the Golden Nugget.
Yeah? Nice.
It was,
Downtown Vegas.
It was fantastic. And for those who don't know, my wife is Chinese American. So I said to the publicist, please put us towards the back.
Yeah. That's damage control.
Yeah.
That's right. So, Christian, before we start talking about Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan with Ken Khachigian, you are a very busy guy media-wise. Tell folks where they can hear you. And by the way, you're too modest, but the name Blatt, it's B like boy, L-A, D like David, T like Tom. Okay, so that's important if they're going to look you up. Right?
Yes, and I do have a show called The Blattcast. It is spelled B-L-A-D-T-C-A-S-T. And a few months ago, we did our 600th episode.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. With both Dennis Miller and John Lovitz together.
Nice.
So we had a lot of fun with that. And I do a show every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific called Who Are These Broadcasters? It is on the YouTube channel for the Who Are These Podcasts network. And we play a lot of videos from the world of broadcasting. It's been a little political heavy this summer, but we try to have fun over there.
So you and I met when you were producing Dennis Miller's national radio show
Absolutely,
for Westwood
yeah.
One. And then I got to fill in on many occasions. And it's funny, people would, they know that I filled in. And so they'd say, oh, what's Dennis like? And I'd say, oh, well, you see, when I'm filling in, that Dennis is not there.
Yeah.
And most people would say, oh, that's interesting. But no, really, what's he like? And I say, you're not really focusing on the concept. I've never met the man. Right. He's not there when I'm
When I'm there, it's because he isn't. And you've been a guest a number of times. It's just you were on the phone.
Well,
so you didn't actually meet him.
And and I have a problem there, too, because it's very sad that Dennis hates me.
Oh.
I don't know if you know that he hates me.
No, I don't think I know that.
No, well, here's the deal. I was on the phone pretending to be a legal expert at one point.
Yeah.
And there he was questioning me. And so he says something very funny as you're about to go into a break. And I'm laughing my ass off. And all of a sudden, the break comes and my laugh ends very abruptly. And Dennis doesn't know that I can hear him and I'm still on the line.
Yeah.
And he says, Christian, that laugh ended kind of abruptly. I'm not picking up a lot of sincerity from that legal guy. Now that, for openers, is the world's worst Dennis Miller impression. But now here I am. I can't say, oh, no, Dennis,
'cause you're
I had I was
Yeah.
choking on a fentanyl pill. That's why it was so abrupt. I can't say that because then he'd know that I heard and he didn't want me to hear.
Right.
So now I know he hates me, except he was so nice when I retired from my law firm a few years ago. He did a nice video.
I do remember
tribute.
he was happy to do it.
So he probably stopped hating me.
We did change that, by the way,
point.
where guests could not hear us when they were on hold.
Good move.
They would hear
Good
music.
move. Yeah, because
it never turned into a real problem, but there was always
well, it did
the
for me.
potential.
I've gone through years of therapy.
No,
okay,
no, it's
hated
fine.
by a guy like Dennis Miller.
Yeah, no.
By the way, what a big fan I was of Norm Macdonald.
Oh my gosh, of course.
And we've talked about this a lot. And so I loved him doing Weekend Update, but I have to say, Dennis is the best. Dennis is absolute best Weekend Update SNL anchor ever.
I always say the same thing. I felt very strongly about that long before I'd ever worked with him. The only other answer I'll accept from anyone is Norm Macdonald. And if they say that they preferred Norm, I'm like, all right, well, we can have a slightly different opinion, but he was also great. He was so much, But there are no other correct answers. There's a pool of two that you can choose from. Other people are very good at it, but they don't. Yeah. It's a very small Mount Rushmore with just those two faces on it.
So we're about to get to Ken Khachigian, and what a refreshing change it'll be, Christian, from the last guy we had on here at Benstown, that Jim Murray of Inside Edition. What a stiff, People see him on Inside Edition, think he's so smart and good looking and charming. You and I know from talking to him off the air. Oh my goodness!
Well,
what a wet blanket! Huh?
The requirements he insisted on for the green room.
Oh, yeah, the blue M&Ms?
Only the blue M&Ms. Yeah. The ones that Van Halen didn't want. That's what he wanted, and he insisted on it. And that was so long ago. We were talking about how O.J. Simpson was contributing to a podcast every week during football season, and he passed away after that. And it was like in the one moment where we could talk about that, and OJ was still out there. And, now I guess that podcast has to find a new NFL correspondent. And if it was any other human that ever walked the earth, maybe I wouldn't make a joke like that. But for OJ, it's all bets are off.
Yes. Well, we'll send a link of the show to Jim just to let him know what we think of him.
Yeah, I'm a fan. Royal's not. But, you're talking about how Ken Khachigian's going to be on.
Exactly.
And we were talking about Dennis Miller a second ago, and I remember a joke of his that's very relevant to this. The first president I remember is Ronald Reagan. I was born in 1976, and he's just sort of this larger than life character. For kids, it was like, oh, he likes jelly beans. I'm like, I don't know anything else about him. I know he likes jelly beans. I like jelly beans. Great. That was the end of it right there. But Dennis had a joke that went back to the 84 election. And he talked about how Walter Mondale won the electoral votes of one state, his home state of Minnesota. And Dennis said, yeah, I didn't even run, and I almost tied the guy.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
And you notice my laugh, it lingered.
Yeah, no, I'm going to clip that out for Dennis and make sure he knows what your legitimate laugh sounds like, not the fake laugh from when you were on the radio.
So with the fentanyl. Hey, we're going to pause when we come back. Ken Khachigian behind closed doors in the room with Reagan and Nixon. Stick with us. Welcome back to Too Many Lawyers, and we are delighted to be joined by Ken Khachigian. He is the author of a brand new book, Behind Closed Doors, in the room with Reagan and Nixon. Ken, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I got to say, I can't remember when I have anticipated more reading a book. It's funny. I was a big fan of the Fugitive television show in the 60s. And I mean, just a maniac for it. When I saw the trailer you would know, Christian, you know everything about pop culture. It was the Fugitive movie, 80s, 90s?
1993.
Oh, my gosh.
Harrison Ford.
This was not a setup, Ken. No. Christian and I have never met, but we have. He's the executive producer of the show. Yeah, David Jansen, the TV show. When I saw the trailer sitting in the theater, my head almost exploded. I thought, oh my gosh, it's like the Twilight Zone. You love the Twilight Zone, then you've got to see the movie too. When I heard about this book, I mean, you're like the Zelig of American politics to be actually in the inner sanctum with both Nixon and Reagan. Now, not everybody's like this, I have to confess. When I told my wife, I was just bubbling with excitement about this. And I said, oh my gosh, you're the speechwriter. I said, honey, for both Reagan and Nixon. And she said, oh, who are you going to have on next? The speechwriter for Coolidge and Hoover? So, she's kind of a Democrat. So we'll forgive her, though, because she's such a sweetheart. Anyway, so Nixon and Reagan, I mean, they got to be the most consequential Republican presidents, if not presidents, period, since the end of World War II.
That's right.
Nixon's opening into China, Reagan's the hardline agenda, dealing with the Soviet Union, leading to winning the Cold War. A lot has been written about them, of course, but your book talks about what it was like to be absolutely in the room with them, how close the two of them were. And you were there for some crucial moments near the end of the Nixon administration, Watergate and so on, and then throughout Reagan. You're a lawyer by training, I know, Ken, but you found yourself drawn to politics early on in your career. And before we get into the details of the book, I'm really curious as to your decision. I mean, you're at Columbia Law School. Nowadays, as somebody at Columbia Law School, they don't want to work for some politician. They want to go out and make as much money as they can as quickly as possible and get the house in the Hamptons. So, and yet that was a dream of a lot of us who went into law, but our first love really was politics. But there was no real path to do that. How did you make the decision to do that? And boy, did it work out wonderfully for you.
Well, I I loved politics from the time of high school. Started out, I don't know if you remember Boys State.
Right.
I went to Boys State in high school, and just got a love of competitive politics, and then in college was student body president at UC Santa Barbara, and even got to introduce Ronald Reagan to the campus when he ran for governor. And
nice.
At Columbia Law School, I was graduated pretty well at UC Santa Barbara, and I've always wanted to be a lawyer when I was younger. And then I got into law school, and boy, it was a sort of a drudgery, and but I was always excited about politics, and then I saw Nixon was going to run for office, and he was sort of an also-ran back then, late 1967. The candidates that were the leading candidates back in late 67, it wasn't Nixon. It was Rockefeller and Romney. They were the leading candidates.
They were, and you mentioned that in the book, but I wanted to, thinking back to everything I've read about it, of course, Nixon, you allude to the two-time loser, he lost and succeeded Kennedy, of course, and then he makes the strange decision to run against Pat Brown for governor in California, and he loses, and then there's the famous obituary for Richard Nixon. And by 67, though, I mean, didn't he get a lot of credit for the huge comeback by the Republicans in the 66 off-year elections after the huge sweep landslide by Johnson over Goldwater in 64? My impression was that Nixon, it was just, was a maniac going all around the country helping everybody and had all these markers. And so that when the campaign revved up, my impression was that it wasn't that he was dead last among Romney and Rockefeller, or am I wrong? Did he have a real uphill battle to beat those guys?
He wasn't dead last, but there wasn't a lot of excitement about him.
Mm-hmm.
And
the new Nixon hadn't been ruled out.
No, he hadn't been ruled out, but Romney was the big glowing light back. He was the governor of Michigan, and he's this handsome, really handsome guy with silver hair, and Rockefeller, of course, the governor of New York.
That's where Mitt got it, I think.
Yeah, and Reagan was a potential candidate.
Right.
He was talking about running for. His folks wanted him to run for president. He had just been governor for just a little over a year in California. So, and Nixon didn't have a high profile. He was smart. After the 66 elections, he collected an enormous amount of chits. He'd campaigned for close to 70 candidates in that election, and he collected a lot of chits, but he decided afterwards to lay low. And then when I saw that article in the newspaper, the New York Times, that he had started a new staff, not the old faces, but a lot of new faces. Pat Buchanan, this young editorial writer from the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, and Ray Price, editorial writer, a more moderate guy from the New York Herald Tribune, and a young fellow, Dwight Chapin, who worked at an ad agency in California. So he had gathered around him a younger team, and that appealed to me. And I thought, here's a chance to get in on the ground floor where somebody that others weren't actually thriving to get onto their campaigns.
Yeah, what a smart idea. And by the way, you're alluding to a great story that folks will read about in detail in the book about how you're reading an article in the New York Times, January 27, 1968, about Nixon running for president. And so you write a letter, and it doesn't work out initially. Tell us how that evolved.
Yeah, it doesn't. They didn't answer it. I sent it to Nixon's law office, and he didn't respond. I thought that was a little rude, by the way.
Yes.
And so I had a carbon copy. Kids don't know what carbon copies are anymore. They don't even know what typewriters are. I had to retype it from the carbon copy. And this time I had a courier, my wife, and retyped it. And she worked on 30 Wall Street, which is around the corner from 20 Broad Street, where Nixon had his law office. And so she hand-delivered it when the Nixon folks said, well, why don't you send it again? So she delivered it to a receptionist at the law office. Then I got a letter back from Pat Buchanan. Pat was the, quote, aide to Mr. Nixon. And he interviewed me. It wasn't the greatest interview in the world. He teased me later. He thought I was a Rockefeller spy because I was at Columbia Law School. But anyway, he said, "Come on in," and then he said, "Well, why don't you start out?" And I start out in correspondence on the ground floor. And I tell people in politics, if you're going to be want to get in politics, don't expect you're going to be a start at the top. Be willing to be a grunt. And so I was a grunt. I answered correspondence. It was a boring job, but every chance I got, I added some research assistance to whatever. I poked my head into people's offices, and Marty Anderson, who was the domestic policy advisor out of Stanford, and he saw some eagerness on my part, and so that summer they offered me a job working in the '68 campaign as a research assistant under Alan Greenspan. So that's how it all started.
So for a while, it looked pretty good for Nixon against Humphrey. Of course, people who know their political history know that it was March '68 is when Lyndon Johnson bowed out. And then, of course, June, after Martin Luther King had been assassinated earlier, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. Looked pretty good for Nixon. But then after Labor Day, things got tightened up. And, of course, there was the October surprise where Johnson, even though I read in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, one of them, that Johnson had some second thoughts. He maybe wanted to get back into it after RFK was killed, but it didn't happen for him. But what did happen was that there was talk about a bombing halt that might have been devastating to Nixon's chances. And so it ended up being very close. I remember staying up real late, and I think Indiana put Nixon over the top in the wee hours of the morning. What's your take before we get to the nuclear core of your book here? What's your take on the rumor over the decades that Richard Nixon and his people tried to interfere through Ms. Chenault with the bombing halt?
It's a real canard. He had nothing to do with that. If the South Vietnamese government had no interest in, why would they want to concede at that point in any giving up on their chances of or conceding to the North Vietnamese at that point? It was in their interest, without any interference by Nixon, to have Nixon win in the election.
Right.
Anna Chenault whatever she did was freelancing on her part. But I think the more important thing was looking at what we should be looking at is what LBJ did to advance the chances of Hubert Humphrey to win. I always felt that the investigation should have been what Lyndon Johnson was doing, conniving with the Humphrey people, with George Ball and Clark Clifford. And I've done some research on my own. I just haven't had a chance to write about it. That it was very much in Humphrey's interest to have that bombing halt to create
Absolutely.
a surprise to help put Humphrey over the top. No, there was no. And I've talked we talked to Nixon at length about this when I was working on his memoirs, and I talked to John Mitchell and I talked to Bob Haldeman. And I made notes about this because I worked on that part of the memoirs, and there was nothing to it whatsoever.
Yeah, and if there was something to it, much more than the sketchy, speculative allegations would have emerged with so many people involved. In the book, you talk about the start of the Nixon administration, which is really interesting to me because you think of a president, sweeping into power. A lot of times it's pretty clear victory, and maybe the Senate, maybe the House, maybe both. But you point out that he had a lot of headwinds facing him, and yet he accomplished a huge amount. Tell us a little bit about those headwinds.
Yes. When Nixon was elected, in fact, I talk about the headwinds. In the entire 5 years of his presidency, Nixon was faced with three major headwinds. He had first of all, the one major one was that Lyndon Johnson left him with 540,000 troops in Vietnam. It was the Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson War, created by the diplomats in the State Department and the Kennedy and Johnson Defense Department that began this war in Vietnam. And so Nixon inherited 540,000 troops in Vietnam, 500 men being killed every month with thousands of casualties included. And then Johnson left him without the resources to fight the war because he had done the bombing halt in October of 1968. So now Nixon not only had the war, but he was unable to have bombing in North Vietnam. So he had that war and inherited, and then all of a sudden, Johnson and Kennedy's war turned into Nixon's war. So all the protests across the country were against Nixon. So that was a major headwind, and all the Democrats and liberals who supported the war in the early 60s and mid 60s and towards the end of the Johnson administration all now turned against Nixon. So that was one headwind. The second headwind was the fact that he had an adversarial Congress for the entire 5.5 years of his administration. He never had a single majority in the House or the Senate during the entire time he was in the presidency, and it was a very adversarial Congress led by partisan Democrats in the House and the Senate. The fact that he got anything done or any Supreme Court appointments or any legislation through, like the EPA or like the Title IX or the desegregation in the South or any of the major accomplishments, the ABM Treaty or the SALT Treaty, some of those things was amazing. And then the third headwind was the fact that he had an adversarial press. The media, from the beginning of Nixon coming into office, we only had three networks at that time. We didn't have cable news. We didn't have social media. We had three networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, all of which were basically fundamentally not overtly anti-Nixon, but generally anti-Nixon. And then you had the three news weeklies that were leaning to the left, and the two major newspapers, Washington Post and New York Times, were fundamentally editorially anti-Nixon. So Nixon was faced with major headwinds throughout his presidency, and we were fighting that within. And I was there. I was there at ground zero. That's where I learned a lot of my persuasive writing skills, because I was sitting there writing constantly, trying to communicate support for the Nixon administration throughout all that time I was in the Nixon White House.
We're talking with Ken Khachigian. He's author of the book I'm holding up right here, Behind Closed Doors, in the Room with Reagan and Nixon. So let's move ahead to Watergate. And one of the most talked about aspects of your book, I think, Ken, is your take on Watergate and whether Nixon should have resigned. There's sort of a conventional wisdom that the June 23, 1972 smoking gun tape, Oval Office meeting between Nixon and Haldeman was really the straw that broke the camel's back, that caused Goldwater and the rest of the senators to hike up the hill and go tell Nixon, okay, you've totally lost support, you got to leave. And the conventional wisdom is that what that tape shows is that Richard Nixon said to Haldeman and others, okay, so we gotta get the FBI off of investigating Watergate, the burglary. So tell them it's a big fancy CIA operation. And that sounds a whole lot like obstruction of justice, and boom, he's out of office. Your take is different. Tell us your take and explain your thoughts that you conveyed to Richard Nixon, contrary to advice he was getting from others, that he should stay and fight.
Well, the problem is that we were in such an intense period at the time, and we had been fighting this issue for 2 years, and the controversy was so intense, and between the Senate Watergate Committee and the Special Prosecution and the House impeachment, if you can imagine, it was like a pressure cooker within the White House. And that last week, when after the Supreme Court forced us to turn over the tapes, and in July and August. And there we were in the White House, and we had turned over the tapes, and then Al Haig said, well, we've got a problem with one of the tapes. And these were hard to hear to begin with. They were very scratchy, hard to listen to. And the June 23rd tape, at first glance, it appeared that Nixon was saying to Haldeman, have the CIA to tell the FBI to put off the investigation and to clear off on this, and it sounded like an obstruction of the investigation. But as we've learned, as we've examined this tape over the years and gotten a clearer view of it, what it was is that there were two Democrats who had contributed to the Nixon Campaign Committee in 1972. and they had done it through sort of a Mexican cutout, Mexican bank cutout, and it would have been an embarrassment to these two Democrats to have contributed to the Nixon campaign. And what Nixon was saying to Haldeman was have the CIA suggest to the FBI to get off on this investigation to protect the identity of these two Democrats because it was embarrassing. And the Justice Department said that this had nothing to do with the Watergate break-in itself, that it was not an obstruction of the Watergate break-in. It had nothing to do with it. So, and John Dean, who was not exactly
no friend of Nixon,
not on his Christmas card list, has subsequently actually written that conceded that this was the point of this tape, and that that June 23rd was not a smoking gun; it was shooting blanks. I call it a water pistol. So what Nixon was saying had nothing to do with obstructing the investigation of the Watergate break-in. Was saying, hey, we want to get off on this embarrassment.
Yeah, so we're kind of in the realm of alternate history. And on that issue, I'm interested in your take of burning the tapes. After a subpoena comes in, if you burn tapes, then you're in some trouble.
You are obstructing justice.
But arguably, you're in more trouble if the tapes survived and people perceive them as justifying your impeachment and conviction and removal. So you might be able to weather the storm, saying, I'm going to have to, even though I've been subpoenaed, I have to burn these tapes because everybody who communicated with me assumed it was totally private. I just can't allow this. But let's go back before. Was there any thought, discussion, any serious consideration given to destroying the tapes before the subpoenas came in? I mean, you think about attitudes like, well, I want them for history. I want them to be able to correct the record if somebody lies and says something I can prove that is wrong. It would certainly help writing a book to have those tapes. And yet, I think a lot of people who look at this situation say, well, if he had just had a bonfire before the subpoenas, he'd still be in office. What's your take on that?
That's what Pat Buchanan's take was. Pat suggested strongly that just get rid of the tapes, burn the tape, or that was a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't burn them. You'd erase them or degauss them or whatever the process would be.
Although you might need to burn them because, as I understand it, and Darren, our expert audio guy here, probably knows better than I, you can go through multiple layers and try to find out what was, it could be recovered.
Get rid of them in some fashion. Find a way to dump them in the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
But anyway, Pat suggested to the president that he get rid of the tapes. But I think the president probably had two things in mind. A, it would make him appear to be guilty,
right?
And B, that there was so much history involved that there was all these sensitive negotiations he had involved in, all these discussions on foreign policy issues, and I think people in conversations they tend to think that all the good things that you discuss in your conversations are going to be remembered, and nobody's going to think about all the gossip that you engage in.
Right.
And what people love to focus on these tapes are the slang or the gossip or the innuendos or the things he said about staff members or the slurs or things like that, which should be overlooked. I mean, some of the worst things that people ever said. FDR said some very horrible things. Made some very horrible ethnic slurs.
Same with LBJ.
Yeah, and LBJ, but which have been overlooked, and Harry Truman as well. But those have been focused on so much, and they keep being reiterated and reiterated. But the tapes are what they are, and it really is too bad.
Speaking
I guess
of
somewhere the next 100 years or 150 years, things will change, but I don't know.
Speaking of tapes and embarrassment, maybe you can tell me if you've heard this story. I don't know that it's true, but I've heard that when Ted Kennedy was married in the late 50s, and John was best man maybe, and they were having a Kennedy wedding rehearsal, which was taped, videotaped, or whatever they used back then, because it was Kennedy. And a hot mic captured as they were walking through the church, John Kennedy saying to Ted, you seem kind of glum, but don't worry, just because you're married, you can still sleep with other women. Have you ever heard that rumor?
No, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. Well, it's probably in a vault someplace.
President Kennedy perfected that art.
Yeah. So let's talk about the David Frost interviews.
Sure.
Nixon resigns. You're called to San Clemente to help out.
Mm-hmm.
Nixon needs money, and they're dangling some money, and he gives him an opportunity to give his side of the story. It'll be contentious, of course. I mean, David Frost isn't, David Boies of the 1970s, but he's a sharp guy. Well, what was your involvement, and tell us about that experience?
Well, I had been working on the memoirs as a researcher, and President Nixon asked me to take time off from working on the memoirs to lead the research in preparation for the David Frost interviews. Diane Sawyer, by the way, who was also working on the memoirs,
right,
was the sort of I was called she was the Watergate expert.
And in your book, you explain you and she didn't always see eye to eye on the input to the president.
Right. We didn't, and which was, I guess, healthy in one respect. But she also was subsequently took some time off to help brief him on the Watergate part of it. But I was the lead researcher. I was in charge, and he wanted me to take the lead in preparation of briefing books. And then when we do have a photo of about a stack of 30 briefing books that I prepared along with Diane and another fellow, Ray Price.
And from the perspective of David Frost and the media, they wanted Nixon to say, mea culpa, yes, you got me, I was terrible. If you're going to give me all this money, I'll give you what you want, and just say, absolutely, I broke the law.
Yes. I mean, that was the main interest for Frost. I mean, we taped, I think, something like a total of 27 or 29 hours. I can't remember the amount of hours for what would be a 4 series of interviews that would be on television. Ended up as 4 hours. And so it would be reduced down. That's the problem with doing it, because you'd be edited down. But the real interest, by the way, it was the most watched television show ever in history, the Watergate show.
Wow, even bigger than the Who Shot JR episode?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Well,
or the finale of The Fugitive in August 1967.
Certainly of a news show. I don't know of any television show in history.
Right.
Certainly of a news show. You may want to go back and of the Who Shot JR and whatever. It was like 60 million people watched.
Wow.
The Watergate portion of it. So we had to prepare, and because there was discussions of foreign policy and domestic policy, and there were Vietnam and everything else. But the focus for Frost in the first interview was going to be on Watergate, and so we had to prepare for that. And Nixon had to come to grips with come to grips with 2 or 3 major things. One, did he mislead the American people? And 2, had he committed a crime? And those were, I think, did he obstruct justice? Did he commit an impeachable offense? Those were things that his adversaries were looking for him to admit to those things. And his supporters were looking for him to find a way to acknowledge that he had probably done some things wrong and some things right. And anyway, we had to cope with that. And so the book I think that's probably the most dramatic chapter in the book, in terms of um, in terms of the way I deal with the back and forth of how we dealt with it, the conversations with the president, the struggles we had within the staff. I have the precise dialogue with the president, the discussions with David Frost, how we talk behind the camera, the dialogue we had in between sessions of the tapes.
Did you have actual mock cross-examination sessions where you or Diane Sawyer would play the part of David Frost, or was it more just general discussions?
That was not his style. We did pose to him just in conversation. Here's what he would be looking for, and here's how he would be posing it. But we didn't do any of that mock stuff. He would think that was sort of BS, I think.
I wonder, it's interesting to me because having practiced law for a bunch of years, and when we would come up on really important oral arguments, particularly appellate arguments, clients like to have what they call the murder board, where they actually have, sometimes they, rent out a mock courtroom, and the clients will study up and ask the toughest question and force the advocate to respond. But my impression is that politicians generally don't like that, even though it probably would improve their performance in a debate setting or a David Frost interview setting. But yeah, it's no fun. And since they're sort of at the apex, why should they have to put up with that, I guess?
Well, it's because it's the way he prepared for press conferences. He studied, he made notes, he studied, and we did have a back and forth, and I discussed that in the book. He would say, if I say this, it will be taken this way, and then he had to think through how his answers would be reflected in the family, and how history would take his answers. But at the end, he came up with his own way of dealing with things. He felt that on the very big issues of Watergate, he felt that he had not misled the people, but that on certain points that some of the things he had said in press conferences or in written statements, that what he had said could be construed to have not been fully or completely truthful, but that on the very big issues that it had been truthful. He had no involvement in the break-in, and basically he was engaging in political damage control the whole time. And
right.
And at the very onset, and like on the June 23rd tape, he didn't even really have that much information on what was going on. He didn't know what the hell was happening.
Right. We're talking with Ken Khachigian, author of Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. So let's move ahead.
Well, let me just jump in for a second.
Absolutely.
Because,
Christian Blatt, our executive producer.
Ken, you're absolutely right. In terms of single network news broadcast, the Frost-Nixon interview, the first part called Watergate, had 45 million viewers. And so that is the highest ratings for a single network news broadcast. The Apollo 11 moon landing had somewhere between 125 to 150 million. However, that's over a number of networks, and it's a little bit harder to quantify. And to Royal's point, when you look at the top 20 just overall ratings, 19 of them are Super Bowls, and at number 11 is the final episode of MASH with 105 million viewers.
Ah, okay.
But it's mostly Super Bowls, which makes sense. So I just thought people might be interested to know where the numbers stack up, because
Nice.
Frost-Nixon absolutely has the crown, but it makes a little bit more sense that maybe a couple more people checked out the moon landing.
It was huge. And, I mean, there's the Ron Howard movie of
Wow.
the interviews, plus the play,
There's
the
the
stage play.
There's the Frost-Nixon movie, and then there's also...
no resemblance to the truth,
Right.
by the way.
Which, most good movies have no resemblance to the truth.
Ron Howard came to see me.
Did he?
To discuss with the fellow who wrote the script, Peter Morgan, and they showed me the script, and Ron Howard dropped by my San Clemente office at the time, and asked me what I thought, and I read.
And you said Andy Griffith would be ashamed of you.
That's it. I should have, and the biggest thing was the folks at the Starbucks below my office said, "Oh my gosh, Ron Howard's here at the Starbucks.
Yeah, we recognize his baseball cap.
Yeah. So I said to them, I said, the script here, a lot of these things you've got in these things aren't even close to being truthful.
And he said, your point would be?
The scene like the Nixon, this drunken phone call to Frost. Where did you come up with that? And Peter Morgan says, well, Ken, after all, it's entertainment.
Yeah. At least he's honest.
My gosh.
So let's talk about go toward the Reagan administration now. Between the 74 resignation of Nixon and the 80 election of Reagan, tell us a little bit about what you are doing and how you kind of morphed into a Reagan guy with the Nixon stuff on your resume.
Well, I have ultimately Nixon. We finished the memoirs and Frost interviews. Nixon sort of has an expiation and then we finished the memoirs, come out in spring of 1978, and he's getting really restless. We have a trip to Europe, and 1979 rolls around, and he's restless, and he wonders about what he's going to do next, and it's difficult for people to come out to California to visit with him, and so pretty soon he's deciding he wants to move back to New York, and he kept me on for a while as a part-timer, and I needed to have some work, so I started looking around. I got a couple of private clients, and then I did some part-time research for the Reagan people's on their campaign that was just starting up. Marty Anderson was over there, Lynn Nofziger was over there, some old pals, and Jim Lake. But I really, as the campaign heated up, I really wanted a full-time job in that campaign as heading up research, but I couldn't really get a job. And Nixon said, you really need to meet with Stu Spencer, who ran Reagan's campaigns for governor. So I went over to meet with Stu, but Stu had run Jerry Ford's campaign for president in '76, so he wasn't on the Reagan's Christmas card list because he had run a pretty rough campaign against Reagan in '76. But the good news for Stu's point of view and my point of view was I got a good relationship with Stu, and the Reagans got in big trouble in August and September of 80 because the campaign wasn't going well. He didn't have good leadership. He was stumbling around. He was making a lot of rookie mistakes.
It's a bad time to stumble with 2 months to go.
Yeah, exactly. He was exactly, and Nancy was very unhappy. And Mike Deaver actually was not back in the campaign that summer, and so they brought Mike Deaver back, who was very close to him personally. And maybe Deaver had something to do with saying you got to bring Stu back. So they swallowed their pride and brought Stu back. And Stu said, "Well, if you're going to bring me back, I get to choose. I get to run the campaign from the plane. You're not going to run it from the headquarters. That means I get to choose the press spokesman. I get to choose who runs policy. I get to choose who runs the tour, and I get to have my own speechwriter." And at that point, I get a phone call from Ed Meese with 5.5 weeks to go. And Ed says, "Can you drop everything and join us in 5 days at LAX and join the campaign?" And I said, "Of course." But I said, "You sure speechwriting?" And he said, "Yes, they want you as a speechwriter." Well, that's not the role I envisioned. But I wasn't going to argue.
Right.
And so I packed my bags, and I think it was September 23rd that I joined the campaign.
And you came up with one of the most amazing lines in the history of American politics. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? I mean, it was a magic phrase that really helped Reagan a lot.
Yeah, and I still don't know how. Sometimes those things just spring from your head in the still of night or in the heat of the campaign, and you're looking for that phrase that just strikes at the heart of the campaign. Jimmy Carter, he was a pretty weak president, and inflation was horrible, and unemployment was bad, and they were complaining about sort of a national malaise. People didn't have hope. We had hostages in Iran for over 100 days, and people had unhappy just all across the board. We had planes that couldn't fly. Our Navy was down, and America was just in bad shape. And so the question is, with mortgage rates at 17% and inflation at
stagflation.
Yeah, stagflation. Inflation was running at 12.5%. Unemployment was around 7 or 8%, and there was a lot of hopelessness across the country. So just somewhere along, the original phrase was at the Oxford Mall in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, was ask yourself, are you better off today than you were in 1976? And then we tweaked it a few days later.
Nice.
Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?
Yeah, definite improvement. So he overcomes the stumbles. A big win against Carter. I can remember Carter conceding early, like something like 5 or 5:30 p.m. Western Pacific time, which infuriated the Democrats, Jess Unruh and all the rest of them, or whoever was running the show then, because the Democrats said, "Oh, Jimmy Carter conceded, so I guess we don't have to go vote."
Right, exactly.
So 4 years later, there's another stumble when Reagan is debating Walter Mondale, and he just really does not have a good night, and he's a lot older. And then the second debate comes along, and I wanted your thoughts on that second debate when a softball question, or it turned out to be a softball question by the moderator, asks Reagan about, what about your age? And he says, well, I will not exploit for political purposes the relative youth and inexperience of my opponent. And that was, tell me about that. Were you involved in the preparation for the debate? Did he come up with that line, do you think, spontaneously? Was that kind of planned? What was the deal?
That was just right out of his head.
Really?
Well, it was planned, but it was planned by him.
Okay.
And I don't know where he got it or how he thought of it. He had obviously...
He's a showman.
Yeah, he's a showman, and he'd probably been thinking about it. I don't know where or when, but he had been thinking about it. Nobody wrote it down for him. Nobody came up with it for him. And we got him reinvigorated after that first debate when we put him on the campaign trail a few days after that first debate. We put him on the campaign trail. I discuss it in the book in some detail. Nancy got very, very angry after that first debate because he was over-prepared, and I give the full history of it, and I think that's one of the reason readers need to look at the book, is because I set the history straight on that whole sequence, because they battered him with too many facts, and he stumbled because they prepared him wrong. They had the wrong people in the room with them. Jim Baker, who was in charge of debate preparation, had his deputy, Dick Darman, set up the debate with Dave Stockman. And those were absolutely the wrong people to have in the room with Reagan. He was unfamiliar with a lot of the faces. They battered him with facts, and they took away his self-confidence. And so he didn't do well. So 5 days later, we put him on the road in Ohio, and they assigned me to write the speech, basically beating Mondale's brains out at 5 different stops on a whistle stop tour, and that rebuilt Reagan's confidence. And so by the time we got to that second debate, Reagan was feeling a lot better about himself, and I think they eased up on the debate preparation, and we started cruising right after that, and it got a lot better.
Nice. We're talking with Ken Khachigian, author of Behind Closed Doors, in the room with Reagan and Nixon. I want to talk about the Cold War. The old Chinese proverb, failure is an orphan, success has 1,000 fathers. A lot of debate over how we won and who's responsible. And a lot of the Bush folks point to the fact that he handled it very well in terms of not dancing on the grave. But from my perspective, I'm a little biased because one of the guys around Reagan was William Clark, who I worked for as a student law clerk, and he was nice enough to perform my wife's and my wedding. So I kept in touch with him. And I'm interested in your thoughts about him, his relationship with Reagan, and the Cold War issue, because my impression is that Clark was a hardliner, Reagan was a hardliner. They stuck to their guns about SDI, Star Wars. The physicists may have said it's a total fantasy, but Gorbachev didn't think it was a total fantasy. He was willing to give everything up in order that we would say, we won't experiment up in the sky. Is it your thought that people like Clark and of course Reagan primarily won the Cold War because of that hard line that led to the bankruptcy of the Soviet Union, or is another perspective more accurate?
Well, that was certainly a part of it. SDI was, and I came in to work on the 87 State of the Union, and we maintained, we were sure to mention SDI in that speech. And by the way, Cap Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, was a hardliner as well.
Right.
You had George Shultz had a sort of different view of diplomacy, and so there was some tension between the two, and I think Reagan did want a different view towards Gorbachev. Lady Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, said, if you want to make some progress, you're going to have to soften your tone a little bit. And I was involved in that in a speech prior to his first Geneva summit. And yet, to really get progress, he couldn't give up on SDI, because that really made Gorbachev know that America was going to have a strong position. And Bill Clark, being the friend that he was with Reagan, and being someone who would backstop Reagan on a significant issue like that, even though there were some others in the State Department. The State Department always, because they were diplomats, were always afraid of poking the opposition in the eye. And
Nancy was afraid of Ronnie looking like a warmonger. She wanted him to be a titan of peace. But, I mean, in retrospect, if she had her way, and if George Shultz, who I think was in league with her, had his way, then maybe we wouldn't have won the Cold War.
Well, at the end, who knows, and maybe it was the combination, but still, I think at the end he had to stick to his guns. And I think in the end, it was his gut hardline feeling that prevailed, in my judgment. I think Mrs. Reagan, in her heart of hearts, wanted her husband to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And it always bothered her that back in the mid-'60s, he was viewed as a warmonger, and somebody was going to push the button and start a nuclear war.
Right.
And in the 76 campaign, the Ford people ran an ad. Governor Reagan couldn't start a war, but President Reagan could.
Mm-hmm.
And that always troubled that they portrayed her husband as being militaristic and warmonger. And so she wanted to soften his image, and that was a part of the tension we had in the '88 convention speech as well. She didn't want him to give a tough political speech. She wanted it to be all sort of sunshine and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Isn't that interesting? When it's over, I mean, the 8 years are in the books, and obviously he's still going to be around, but she's still focused on that. So he backing up a little, he wins Reagan hugely in '84. And when you think, Ken, when you think about 49 states to one, okay, in 1972, when Nixon beat McGovern 49-1, it was the war, and McGovern was portrayed, acid, abortion, and amnesty, and so on. But again, 49-1. Just think of today's climate. Can anybody conceive of a 49-1 victory on either side in the divisive nature of American politics now? I mean, California, New York, they're always going to go one way, and the South and the Midwest, they're always going to go. So isn't it kind of weird that we had a couple of 49-1s that would just be utterly inconceivable at this point?
Well, history there's a long view of history. At some point, somebody's going to maybe do it. Who knows? But I can't conceive of it right now. And we almost won Minnesota. We only lost it by 6,000 votes.
Wow.
We took a final shot at it. We made a final stop.
Yeah.
In Minnesota.
So the second term has the Iran-Contra scandal, and some people wonder if maybe the last couple of years the mental issues are starting to show. What was your perspective of enduring the Iran-Contra times and how Ronald Reagan was doing in the last couple of years?
Well, Iran-Contra had nothing to do with his loss of mental acuity. I worked on his 87th State of the Union, which included some discussion of Iran-Contra, and I worked on his 88 farewell speech at the convention. So that means I worked with him right up to the end of his presidency, and I saw no loss of cognitive ability right up to the very end. And I was with him in 1990 when he met with President Nixon, the final chapter in the book, which is a fascinating chapter of the two giants meeting together.
It is a wonderful chapter. It's titled "The Lions Gather," and the occasion is you explain in the book is the dedication, I guess, of the Nixon Library, and Richard Nixon invited you to attend a meeting that he was going to have with Ronald Reagan at Reagan's Century City office.
Right, and the two presidential giants and political legends of last quarter of the 20th century, and so that's up into through 1990, and I saw no loss of, his mind was just as sharp as ever. So the first time I saw any slippage was in 92 when he was campaigning. I can't remember who it was for. He was at a fundraising event, and I was there. And it was the first time that I walked up to him, and he had a funny look. He looked at me in a way where he couldn't right away remember who I was. So that was 2 years before he declared that he had been diagnosed. So at that point, he probably had mild cognitive impairment or maybe pre-dementia. But that was 4 years after he left the presidency. So I would say this regarding Iran-Contra, that was him just being probably a little bit naive about what was happening and not being on top of the matter from day one, and being sympathetic towards what the Contras and the funding, and just relying too much on what his staff was doing and just letting things slip between the cracks. But it didn't have anything to do with his brain.
Right. Well, I got to say, Ken, this is a fabulous book. I really enjoyed reading it. I hope everybody goes out and gets it. Behind Closed Doors in the Room with Reagan and Nixon, you did a fabulous job, and it's a real gift to folks who are interested in politics everywhere, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. Christian.
Just before you go, there were a couple of thoughts that I had as I was listening to you speak, Ken. Sure. I look at a lot of all of the Nixon stuff is history to me. I was born in 1976. Reagan's the first president I remember. So as somebody like me sort of looks back, and when we were learning about it in school, the thing that always boggled my mind is whomever comes up with, whomever performs, I don't even care about that. But the idea of the break-in itself seems like this might have been the one election where it couldn't have been less necessary to go see what your opponent is up to. Did it in the moment feel like, oh, I don't know, maybe McGovern's building something, or was it one of those, well, why did you even go and do that? We don't need to know what he's up to. Or is that just sort of the lens of this many years later?
Well, you're right. It was probably too much money and sitting around the campaign office and Gordon Liddy and folks who had arranged all this just having too much eagerness on their hands and wanting to do, show themselves to be tough guys. I don't know. It's hard to figure out sometimes why something stupid like that happens.
You're saying it's hard to imagine what motivates a man like G. Gordon Liddy. I think most of us can probably subscribe to that, especially
or Chuck Colson, perhaps.
Right. Well, but I mean, Chuck wasn't involved in this. Chuck sometimes unfairly gets a lot piled on him.
The famous expression about how he would roll over his grandmother for Richard Nixon.
For Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
But he, it turns out he was unfairly prosecuted. My colleague Jeff Shepard has become quite a Watergate scholar and has turned up evidence that the prosecutors felt that the prosecution against him was a sort of a 50-50 decision, but they felt they had to do it because the appearances on him were such that if they didn't prosecute him, it would look bad that he seemed to, I was sort of like they almost had to go after him kind of thing, but they felt they had a really weak case, and the reason you could prosecute a ham sandwich in D.C. against a Republican because the juries there were so easy to convince against any Republican. There was virtually no way a Republican was going to get a not guilty verdict. So there's evidence in the files now of the Special Prosecutor's Office that was less than a stellar case against Chuck. So, but anyway, turns out he repented and turned his life around.
Pretty sincere guy. That prison ministry wasn't a flash in the pan. He did that the rest of his life.
It was all sincere, and it turned out, and he reformed a lot of people in his lifetime.
All right, Ken Khachigian.
Would go to my website.
Oh yeah, please list the website.
Yeah, it's www.reaganandnixon.com. Reaganandnixon.com. It's not an ampersand. It's just Reagan, A-N-D, Nixon. So reaganandnixon.com. There's a lot of information on it, and they can buy the book there or just get more information. And there's a lot of my interviews on there and some of the book reviews. So it's reaganandnixon.com.
And I think it's very smart, Ken, of you not to expect people to be able to spell your last name.
Right. Well, they could go to kenkhachigian.com too, but that's probably
if they can spell the last name. Right. All right. Thanks again. We'll see you next time on Too Many Lawyers. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thank you.